Thank you. So, good morning, everyone. I am Rashmi, President of Kartavya, the Civil Services Society, and I welcome you all to this third event of our annual event, Junoon. Moderators of today's session are Ayushi Singh and Lakshay Rana. So, without any further delay, I would like to request both of you to please start the event.
आज रास्ता बना लिया है तो कल मंजिल भी मिल जाएगी हौसलों से भरी है कोशिश एक दिन जरूर रंग लाएगी A very warm and heartfelt good morning to everyone present here. I am Ayushi Singh, an Executive Council member of Kartavya, the Civil Services Society of Kirodimal College, University of Delhi. I feel extremely honored and privileged to welcome you all to this another event of our annual fest. Founded in 2017, Kartavya endeavors and strives to provide a collaborative learning ambience to all the learners, which is emblematic of our principle Aspiratory Corps. And Junoon, our annual fest, is the reflection of enthusiasm and the culmination of hard work of every member of Junoon, every member of Kartavya. As part of Junoon, we are hosting a plethora of brainstorming, intellectual sessions, and experiencing the bliss of learning and synergy with our contemporaries. And today, we're hosting the third event of this fest, which is a lecture on Choices, Global Order, and Making of India's Foreign Policy by Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Carrying the session forward, I'd like to invite my co-host for the day, Lakshay Rana, to briefly introduce our guest to the audience. Over to you, Lakshay.
Thank you, Ayushi. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon is a distinguished fellow at CSEP and a visiting professor of international relations at Ashoka University. His long career in public service spans diplomacy, national security, atomic energy, disarmament policy, and India's relation with its neighbors and major global powers. He did his schooling from Scindia School, Gwalior, and later did his post-graduation from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. He started his career in 1972 in the Indian Foreign Service. Sir has also served as the National Security Advisor to the Indian Prime Minister from 2010 to 2014 and as the 27th Foreign Secretary from 2006 to 2009. He was the Ambassador and High Commissioner of India to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan from 1995 to 2006. He has also served as member of India's Atomic Energy Commission and India's missions to the International Atomic Energy Agency and to the United Nations as well. Sir currently serves as the chairman of the advisory board of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. Our today's session is going to be about India's foreign policy and the changes taking place in it with the changing times. To delve deeply into the nitty-gritties of the Indian foreign policy, we have invited Ambassador Menon to enlighten us more on the topic. अब मैं आज के मुख्य अतिथि एम्बेसडर मेनन जी से आग्रह करूंगा कि वे इस सेशन को आगे बढ़ाएं. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you for asking me to Kartavya and for turning out in such numbers. When I was at Delhi University at your age, I was normally asleep at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. But I was asked to speak on global order and the making of Indian foreign policy. So what I'll try and do is that in about half an hour, try to describe the three main phases of global order that independent India had to operate in to craft its foreign policy and how we adjusted our foreign policy. And those three phases are the Cold War, the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, and now a world adrift, a world between orders. And I will then try and describe briefly some of the outstanding issues that we face at present, which I think are going to determine our future. And thereafter, I'd be very happy to hear your comments, questions. But before that, a word on why do we have a foreign policy? What's the purpose of Indian foreign policy? Because it's against that purpose that I think you can measure success, failure, and also which gives you a sense of the priorities. If you think back to India at independence, we were frankly in a completely abject condition. One of the world's richest, most advanced societies and economies had been reduced to one of the poorest, most backward. I mean, literacy was around 14%, 8% among women. Life expectancy was around 26 years. That's it. And disease was rampant, hunger was rampant. Over 80% of the population was below the poverty line. So it was clear that the task, the primary national task, was to transform India, was to develop India, was to get out of this condition in which 2 centuries of colonialism had left us. But it was also clear that we could no longer follow the policies of the Raj, of the British Indian government, for 3 fundamental reasons, because the situation, the order around us had changed. One was that Pakistan had been formed, India had been partitioned. We now had an inveterately hostile neighbor to our west who cut us off from Central Asia, from West Asia. Secondly, China occupied Tibet in 1950. And for the first time in history, we had Chinese on our borders. Before that, we had a boundary with Tibet, which was accepted through custom, tradition, usage, parts of it by treaty. And we really didn't have a problem before that. And the third big change, of course, was that the world entered the Cold War. The global order now became a bipolar order, because the Cold War was a global contest between 2 systems, between the socialist system led by the Soviet Union and essentially the capitalist system led by the US. Both the Eastern and the Western offshoots of Europe, created in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the huge Russian expanse and the West and America, these were in competition with each other, ideological, economic, military, political. And they were dividing the world. And in this context, the Cold War actually affected everybody's capacity to deal with the international system. Their choice, of course, especially the US choice, was that countries should join them. Their attitude, Dulles' attitude, was if you're not with us, you're against us. The Soviet Union was the weaker of the 2. Militarily, she was all right, but economically, she was much weaker than the Western system. And so for her, if you were neutral was enough for her. As long as you were not with her enemies, she was happy. Europe was the central fault line because that is where their contention was sharpest. Germany had been partitioned. There was essentially both blocs confronted each other in Europe. But the killing fields were in Asia. And this is a constant geopolitical fact. The fighting, the killing, the wars actually take place. Nobody wants to fight where it really matters, which is in their home. So they will fight on other people's territory, but they'll also fight in places where they can fight without expecting it to lead to a direct clash between the 2 superpowers, because this was a nuclear world. And the risk was, if the 2 superpowers actually fought, that you would end up with a nuclear exchange, which would annihilate human civilization. So it was a new world order, something that had not existed before. Our own situation was terrible, and we could not transform ourselves on our own. Because if you look at India's resource endowment, we need to import energy, we need to import fertilizers, we needed technology, we needed capital if we were to transform India, to grow India. So the function of India's foreign policy, right from the beginning, from 47, has been to enable the transformation of India, to create an enabling environment where we can, or at least use the external environment to assist in the transformation of India. And this has been agreed across the political spectrum, from extreme left to extreme right. They might differ on how and so on internally, but basically the goal of Indian foreign policy has been the same. So what did India choose to do in this situation? Completely new international situation, very weak internally, but needing the world for the transformation of India. He made a relatively brave choice. Rather than choosing one bloc or the other, rather than joining either the socialist camp or the Western imperialist camp, as we used to call it, we chose non-alignment. And we chose not to join either, but we chose, therefore, to work with both. And as we kept trying to describe to them, this was not neutrality. Neutrality means not getting involved, not being engaged. It was the opposite. For us, non-alignment was a policy. It was that we would choose our stance on each issue depending on the merits of the issue. So why non-alignment? Because frankly, nobody shares our condition. There's nobody whose interests coincide with ours. Show me another country at our level of development with our interests, with our location, with our history. And other countries' interest in India's transformation is minimal. I mean, they will try and use it for their own purposes, but beyond a point, frankly, none of the established powers certainly will want to see a rising power like India improve her position beyond a point, and only so far as it's useful for them in dealing with their adversaries. But it was a brave choice for a country like India. And it was not a negative choice, not a choice of neutrality. If you look at Indian actions, foreign policy actions through the 50s, we were very activist in our neighborhood. We, for instance, when King Tribhuvan sought refuge, we helped to reinstate him and help the democratic movement in Nepal in the 50s. We directly helped the Indonesian freedom movement. Sukarno was, by the way, the first guest at our first Republic Day parade. In Burma, UNU later said that Burma would not have been an independent country and united if it weren't for the military help that we gave, India gave in 49 for 50, when we sent not just weapons and aircraft, but also troops. We were active in the Korean War. We were chairman of the UN Commission, actually, before the war, during the war, and the repatriation of prisoners of war. Indochina, we were chairman of the International Control Commission. So it's not that we didn't choose to take positions on the issues, but we didn't say that the alliance will make our decisions for us. We were not going to hand over that choice to others. Did the policy work? Yes, it did. Ultimately, both sides competed. I mean, how did we get 5 IITs built by different powers? And whether it was steel when countries were not willing, when one bloc was not willing to help us, the other bloc would, and then they would compete. And it worked, I mean, as a policy. Of course, it had its weak moments and in fact, failures. One would be in dealing with China on the border, partly because of the Chinese attitudes and their own internal politics, where they were totally unreasonable and unwilling to compromise. The other was Pakistan, which chose, unlike India, to join one side. It joined CENTO and SEATO, the two US alliance systems in West Asia and in Southeast Asia in 1954 and 1955. But our reaction to that was not, if our adversary joins one bloc, we will join the other bloc. Instead, it was to work with both blocs and to minimize the effect of that. So overall, and in many ways, those were not bad years. If you look at the institution building, if you look at the economic progress during those years, if you look at the basis for change that was laid and the basic shifts, and when I say basis for change, I mean things like land reform, educational institutions, and so on, because these were essential conditions for what India was able to do in later years. So overall, I would say India didn't have a bad Cold War. It wasn't an easy Cold War. It was difficult. But over time, we gained enough strength that by 1971, we were in a position, and this is the whole point of policy, is to improve your options, increase your capabilities, increase your power. And by 1971, we were in a position to assist in the birth of Bangladesh, to change the geopolitics of the subcontinent fundamentally, and to reduce Pakistan to its western wing, and therefore make our life much easier. And since then, frankly, we haven't fought. In the first 24 years of the Republic, we fought 4 wars Since then, we haven't had to fight big conventional wars. We've had conflict, but not full-fledged conventional wars, which shows that the building up of strength has managed to deter our adversaries since 1971. But the 70s and 80s were difficult years, partly because we had to deal with a China-Pakistan-US axis. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the whole business of Mujahideen and jihadi terrorism started with active encouragement from the US, China, and Pakistan. And frankly, the Soviet Union was a declining power at this time. And by the end of the 80s, Soviets had collapsed. The Cold War came to an end, and the world entered a unipolar moment where there was no longer a balance between two superpowers. There was only one superpower left, and that's the unipolar movement. How did we react to it? With fundamental redrafting of Indian foreign policy, even though Narasimha Rao, who was actually responsible for it as Prime Minister, he kept saying he was just doing what Nehru had done many years before and what Rajiv Gandhi wanted to do. But the fact is that there was a fundamental remaking of the policy. One thing, as a result of the Cold War, a lot of the suspicion in India-US relations vanished. Secondly, as we opened up our economy and dismantled the license permit Raj, the economic basis of the relationship with the US was now much better, was much more open. And Narasimha Rao started the process of transforming India-US relations, of making them much closer. With China also, he reached out. The Chinese were in a difficult position. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they were left as the last large communist country on earth. And they thought they had watched communist regimes tumble in East Europe, finally, even in the home, as they saw it, of communism in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And they thought they were next in line for regime change, that the US would turn on them, that they had a big target on their back. And they had just gone through this huge internal shakeup thanks to Tiananmen, where it became clear that their own people wanted much more freedom, much more opening within China. But they had seen what perestroika and glasnost were opening internally, internal liberalization and opening to the outside world had done to the Soviet Union. And they were not going to risk that in China. So what they chose was to tighten internally, but open up externally, join the WTO, and to build a solid economic relationship with the US, so that the US and George H.W. Bush, Father Bush, and the US at that stage chose to work with China. In fact, it was a virtual alliance. They'd worked together in Afghanistan. They had worked together against Vietnam, in Kampuchea through the 80s and early 90s. And they decided to continue with that line. So in reaction to this situation, what Narasimha Rao did was, because the Chinese were so nervous and wanted to concentrate on dealing with the US, and they had their internal problems, we signed a border peace and tranquility agreement with the Chinese, which left us both free to concentrate on our domestic shifts. And we did fundamental reforms at home. At the same time, and that agreement of 1993 basically kept the peace, kept the border as it was for almost 30 years, a little less than 30 years. He also opened an office in Taiwan, which functions just like any normal embassy, without provoking a big Chinese reaction, started diplomatic relations with Israel. He started the Look East policy, with the most dynamic economic region of the world. And these were really the globalization years. The 80s, 90s, and the noughts were really the height of globalization, where the world economy was knit together in a neoliberal framework, it is true. What globalization and things like technology made this possible, ICT, for instance. It became possible actually to think of the world as one economy, and political effects as well. Frankly, with missile ranges and the reach of weapons now, national borders have very little meaning anymore. So at least in a military sense. And the result of that, those two and a half decades of rapid globalization, of increasing integration of the world economy through global supply chains, value chains, was a huge shift in the balance of power from essentially Europe, the mid-Atlantic, to the Asia Pacific, to Asia. The center of gravity of the world economy and of geopolitics is now in the Asia Pacific. In fact, if you just measure where economic activity takes place in the world and plot it on a map, the center of gravity is somewhere east of the Urals and moving eastwards steadily. And as far as geopolitics is concerned, you can see that all the flashpoints and other hotspots are today in the Asia Pacific. But the war is in Europe, because the war is fought where, frankly, the big powers don't feel they will get directly involved. And you can see the war going on in Ukraine. What do I mean by the shift in the balance of power? In 1980, when globalization began, the OECD countries accounted for something like 67% of world GDP. And out of that, about 26% was the US. The rest was Europe, Japan, etc. By 2016, that share had come down to around 40%. And the real gainers were China, who had gone from something like 2.9 to 17.8% of world GDP, and India, which went from, again, about 2.9 or so to about 8% of world GDP. And this was a huge shift. The US stayed at about 25%, but Europe's share had declined rapidly. So Europe's economic weight in the world had declined rapidly. In any case, Europe was not a military power, was not spending her money on militarization. Asia was, whether it's China. In fact, Asia was the center of the world's largest arms race in history over the same decades, because they were gaining prosperity and used the money for that. So you had a shift in the balance of power towards Asia. And suddenly all these hotspots and issues, whether it's East China Sea between Japan and China, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea between China, Vietnam, Philippines, a whole host of ASEAN countries, whether it's the India-China border, suddenly all these became live again. You saw what happened in 2020 on our border. And globalization had two other effects, those decades, the unipolar moment. They created new authoritarian politics in a whole host of countries, partly because globalization led to urbanization. ICT brought the world into the palm of everybody's hand, and people's family, clan, village, wherever, into urban anonymity. And we now have, thanks to, again, technology, a whole new security agenda, whole new domains of contention, cyber, for instance, cybersecurity, space security, outer space. We have issues like climate change, which are a product of this rapid economic development that we've known since World War II, pandemics, energy security, which in India's case is critical, because frankly, if one thing can stop us from continuing to grow and develop, it is energy security. India itself did very well out of globalization. We got, between 2002 and 2012, we pulled 140 million people out of poverty. Sadly, some of them have gone back in. Somewhere around 40 to 60 million are back, thanks to COVID and the pandemic and its slowing economic growth in the last 5 years in India. But we did well out of globalization. In fact, we were the second biggest beneficiary after China, if you look at it in terms of normal metrics of power. So But what globalization has done by shifting power, by changing internal politics, by bringing new authoritarians to power, whether it was Trump, Xi Jinping, whoever, by creating this new security agenda, is actually to make life much harder. There is neither a bipolar nor a unipolar order anymore. The US and others, after the global financial crisis of 2008, each country, each major power is looking out for itself. And there is really no longer an international order. And the proof of this was last year, the last 2 years, when in COVID, where you saw how the world failed to react in an orderly or organized fashion. All these multilateral meetings, the UN, WHO, yeah, lots of G20, G7, everybody met, UN Security Council, every acronym on earth. But did they do anything? Were they effective in their response? No. So there is no order. And I think that was brought home. And COVID actually, the pandemic, actually accelerated these trends that I said, where there's a pushback against globalization. And this is where we are today, a world adrift, where there is no order, there is a pushback against globalization. Each country is looking out for itself. We say Atmanirbhar, China talks of dual circulation, self-reliance. Biden talks of building back better in the US. So we've all turned inwards. And frankly, the prospect for the world also is of a much slower and much more fragmented global economy, as big regional trading blocs have been formed, the RCEP in Asia Pacific, the NAFTA or USMCA in North America, and the EU in Europe. And protectionism is a real problem. We, by the way, are the only major economy who are not part of any of these blocs. So what are our issues before I end today in this world adrift? Our number one political and economic and overall challenge is actually dealing with China, because China's rise has been phenomenal. What China achieved in the last few years has never been done by anybody in history. And frankly, it actually tends to mask the huge achievement that India also achieved in the last 30 years. Our high growth years were really the 90s and the noughts. And those were the years when we did best, if you look at it in terms of transforming India, where we use the world by integrating with the world economy. But China did better. If you look at every metric of power and measure India against the other countries in the world, we have improved our position against every other country except China. China has done even better than we have. And China is the one great power which today makes it clear that she opposes the rise of India, whether it is by supporting our adversaries, whether it's giving nuclear weapons technology to Pakistan or supporting them, or by other forms of pressure. She has made that quite clear. She is the one who opposes your membership of the NSG, for instance. She is the one who will raise Kashmir in the UN Security Council after 40 years when we read down Article 370 and so on. I mean, the list is long. This extended commitment to Pakistan in the CP, the CPEC, the Economic Corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and so on. But China is a multidimensional challenge. She's a challenge on the border, where when she feels strong, when she feels that she can get away with it, she will try and adjust the situation to her advantage. If she's thwarted, if she feels that India has the power to stop her, she won't do it. She will be deterred. So that's an immediate issue. But there is a larger political issue, because China is trying to organize Asia today and tomorrow the world around her. And she makes it quite clear. She said that what she's trying for is a China-centered order. Is she going to succeed? On land, she is actually succeeding, because Russians and the Iranians have been pushed by Western pressure into Chinese arms. And frankly, I think it's short-sighted Western policy, but they are so obsessed with Russia that they have managed to actually create a China-Russia alignment. It was an alignment of convenience, but I think it's increasingly becoming more than that. The second big challenge for us is the world economy. As it slows down, we today are much more dependent on the world, just as China is, by the way, which is why China has trouble with what's happening in Ukraine and the consequences of that. But when we started reform in 1991, about 15.3%, 15.6% of our GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, that had gone up to 49.3%, almost half, just merchandise trade. You add services, you add remittances. The external sector was more than half of India's GDP. It's gone down since, because we have not disintegrated, but we have actually reduced the level of our integration, but it's still up in the 38, 39% of GDP, which is a huge chunk. I don't think we realize how dependent we are on the world. And that integration and engagement is what gave us the high growth years, what gave us the best economic times. So the last 5 years, it's been declining. But these are also the 5 years when we've been raising customs duties. We walked out of the RCP negotiations after 8 years. And frankly, it makes it harder to run a political, defense, other relationship if you don't have an economic leg to stand on. And the Southeast Asians, for instance, will take you seriously when you start the economic engagement, and that's what happened with Look East policy and Act East. Third challenge, the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region, because now that the center of gravity of world politics is here in the Asia Pacific, now the other big powers are seriously interested in the subcontinent. You can see how active China is in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, the US also, and their contention is playing itself out in our periphery, and therefore affects our security. And we have an interest actually in stepping up our game in the subcontinent. Before I end, let me say a word about Ukraine, and then I'll open this up to questions. The fundamental problem in Ukraine is simple. The eastern borders of Ukraine are less than 300 kilometers from Moscow. So from a Russian point of view, to have NATO troops, American troops, whatever, in Ukraine is unacceptable. If Kennedy couldn't accept Russian ballistic medium-range missiles in Cuba in 1962, why should the Russians accept this? But it works the other way around as well. If you look at a map and Ukraine's position, the western borders of Ukraine are, in fact, less than 100 kilometers from Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Warsaw, and about 200 plus kilometers from Berlin. So there's striking distance. So for Russian troops to be in Ukraine is also unacceptable for Western and Central European security for the other countries of that region. Now, the solution is obvious to my mind, to an Indian mind, because we are outside. We would say, yeah, make it neutral. Like you made Austria neutral, like you made, like Finland is neutral, like Belgium, Switzerland, etc. are neutral. Promise that nobody will put troops there or missiles there to threaten each other. But that's not possible. I mean, it tempts the Europeans, but not the US. So we now have a situation where Russia, which has objected at every stage to NATO's expansion eastwards, because at the end of the Cold War in 91, there were only 16 NATO members. There are now 30. And they've promised membership to Ukraine and Georgia as well, which brings them right up to Russian borders. And this is despite a promise made to Gorbachev by Baker, by Kohl, by Genscher, by the Germans, by the Americans, and so on in 1991, when they wanted to reunify Germany. They were willing to say that, don't worry, NATO will not expand eastward or come to your borders. And yet it has. Since 1997, they've been doing it steadily. And at each stage, they have objected. Gorbachev objected, Yeltsin objected, Putin objected to George W. Bush in 2008 when they decided to admit Ukraine as a candidate member. finally, they've taken the law into their own hands, used force. My own sense, frankly, is that India doesn't have to choose sides. From our point of view, the US can't replace Russia, what Russia does with us. I mean, Russia is willing to give us nuclear submarines. Russia works with us in a whole host of sensitive areas that the US is not willing to. And vice versa. Russia can't replace the US as a source of civilian technology, in terms of market, in terms of financial, other calculus. Russia cannot do what US does. So we need both. And frankly, if the US and the West Europeans do not feel strongly enough about Ukraine to send their own troops, then clearly there is room for us, at least, sitting in Asia, miles away. But what is being fought over here is a new European security order. Putin says he's willing to negotiate one. We haven't heard the same willingness from the US. The Europeans are tempted. So we have to see where it goes. The trouble is that we have to deal with the second order effects of the crisis in Ukraine. Very high energy and commodity prices, a much slower world economy, continuing deglobalization in the world economy, much worse US-Russia relations, Russia's alliance of convenience with China being strengthened, the short-term consolidation of NATO, maybe. In the long term, I'm not so sure. It'll probably end up with the Europeans realizing they need to rearm themselves, maybe even create an independent European defense force. But I find a lot of the commentary in the media is really overwrought. Oh, we must choose. Oh, there's tremendous pressure. And if you read Fareed Zakaria and people, they're all saying it's a huge crisis for Indian foreign policy. India must choose. We've faced this kind of argument for over 70 years, and we have always followed our own interest. And I don't see how it's in our interest to choose one side or another, or to pick a fight, which is not our fight. We'll deal with the consequences, but I don't see why we need to choose where we are. So all in all, I'm afraid it's not a very happy prospect. But we've handled much worse, and we've done well if you look at the long term, over 70 years. I mean, I started by telling you how poor our life expectancy, our poverty, other figures were at independence. You know how much better it is today. So I'm an optimist. I actually think that as long as we keep learning from experience, from history, and we keep adjusting to the situation, as long as our understanding is clear, I think we will continue to do well. I'll stop there, and I'd be very happy to hear what you have to say and to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, sir, for this immensely resourceful lecture. Your presence is certainly glorified today's event. Now, moving ahead, I'll be taking questions from the chat box. So the first question we have is from Neeraj. Sir, many highlight that staying neutral over hot potato decision depicts weakness of a nation. For example, India abstained its vote over UNSC resolution on Ukraine crisis. So staying neutral over hot issues is good or bad for our future prospects?
It's not a question of, are you neutral or not? Whoever wants you on his side will tell you, don't be neutral, don't vote against me, don't abstain, because they want you to vote with them, right? And they will tell you, be responsible, stand up, it's good for your ego. They'll feed your ego. How is it in India's interest to pick sides in this fight? On Ukraine, for instance. It doesn't make sense. But where India's interest is involved, yes, we pick sides. If there's a civil war in Sri Lanka, it threatens our security. So we do get involved, but not just involved, we actually send troops. There are issues which affect us directly, and yes, we should pick sides. But for me, the guiding principle has to be Indian interests. And if you can show to me that, and that's why I say non-alignment or strategic autonomy or whatever you call it, every government of India has followed that basic policy. There must be a reason why. It doesn't matter whether the rightist, leftist, whatever, domestically, but every government has followed that policy for over 75 years. Why? There must be some logic to this. It's because our interests drive our policy, because our interests are unique. There is no other country like India in the world with our combination of needs and interests. So we take that decision depending on the circumstance. Non-alignment, strategic autonomy, whatever you call it, is not neutrality. But in each individual case, it is the exercise of your own judgment and the judgment of what is in your interest. So I'm much less worried by all these labels. You know, people will put labels on you. If they like you, they'll say, oh, what a wonderful country you are. If they like what you're doing, like your policy. If they don't like it, they'll say, oh, terrible, you know, you're looking weak. You should be much more responsible. You are now a great power, don't you want? And they'll, especially your ego, they will use your ego to try and get you to do what they want. You should do what's in your interest.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is asked by Neha. Uh, India's ability to live with religious, linguistic, and ethnic differences highlighted its political exceptionalism amidst the proliferation of international conflicts and civil wars around the world. But in the recent years, the sense of creeping Hindu majoritarianism has begun to generate concern among a range of groups. What do you think on this? How domestic actors, policies, issues of our country are shaping our foreign policy today?
You know, I think are in a process of transition domestically, right? We are renegotiating our own social contract. But we have done this constantly from day one. I mean, we moved from a much more openly capitalist sort of economic system to what we called a mixed economy with the industrial policy resolution. We took a much more socialist path. And we've always had to balance internally both economic policy and social policy. To what extent do we interfere in society to try and modernize it and change it? These are huge arguments we've had, whether starting from the Hindu Marriage Act, you know, these are not new arguments. And we are still a society in the process of rapid evolution. I think most people understand that. So I don't think we should panic when we ourselves are going through this kind of change. And you see similar arguments in other countries also. I mean, in US also, and COVID has actually accelerated this. The social contract is being renegotiated. In China also, why is China building such a big surveillance state? Because, I mean, I'm not saying they're negotiating it in the sense of a peaceful democratic process, but the state is actually redefining its contract with its own citizens by building that surveillance state. This is a global phenomenon. And I think most countries understand that other countries have their own internal compulsions and are going through that. Does it affect our ability to deal with the rest of the world? Yes and no. No, because other countries will deal with you irrespective of what they think of your internal policies. If you are useful for them, they will deal with you. And India matters. India is useful to most countries. I mean, you can't talk about energy markets in the world without considering India. You can't talk about maritime security in the Indo-Pacific without considering India. There's a whole host of issues. There are technology issues where India counts. So when you look at that, countries will continue to deal with you, even if they don't like what you're doing internally. If they like it, just as well, but everyone always, however, countries do present foreign policies in terms of values and principles. I'm not saying they act on their values and principles, I'm saying they present it and they find it necessary to do that to their own domestic audience. And if they are holding their nose about what you're doing at home, it becomes that much more difficult. You see this when you hear congressional criticism or US media criticizing Indian internal developments, you know, and you see a lot of that kind of criticism. But will it affect the core of foreign policy practice? I'm afraid not. I'm a realist on this, and I don't think so. And frankly, nobody else has the time or inclination or the energy to get involved in what they regard as your internal affairs. What they will do is make the calculus of, does it reduce your effectiveness as a partner? And that is the dangerous part. If they write off your future, saying, look, these guys can't even get their own internal act together, they're fighting with each other, they're tearing themselves apart, then your foreign policy effectiveness goes down. So that's why my answer is yes and no. You know, it works both ways.
Thank you, sir. Next question we have is from Ayushman Singh. He asks, Sir, China adopted economic reforms in 1978 and we adopted in 1991. There is not as much big gap, but why India is not developed as China?
Three reasons, I think. If you ask me, I mean, I will say to you what I said to Mr. Vajpayee. He asked me once, "Ki ye Cheen ne itna chalang kaise mara?" It's a lovely word, ne? Chalang. And it's true. I mean, it's what they did. In 1980, we were roughly the same size GDP, same technological levels, and we were probably more integrated in the world economy than China was. But now China is about 5 times our size in terms of GDP, technologically much more advanced. How did they do this? There are 3 advantages. One is they operated, because of the destruction of the Cultural Revolution, greatly forward. They had a blank slate to write on in every sense, economically, socially also. Secondly, they followed a completely ideological economic path under Deng Xiaoping. No longer true, by the way, which is why they've slowed down tremendously under Xi Jinping. But under Deng, as he described the approach as crossing the river by feeling the stones underfoot. In other words, if something works, if you can find a solid foothold, then put your foot on it and take the next step. Look for another foothold. If it doesn't work, find another foothold. So all these big things that they did, you know, opening Shenzhen as a special economic zone, each of these things was done as an experiment. And increasingly, people were allowed to experiment, whether it was starting up township village enterprises, whether it was you. And so it made a huge difference. You know, and there was a willingness to be complete. Third reason, and I think this is very important. For the last 40 years, China has been a sponge, absorbing everything from abroad. Because of this fundamental conviction that China is backward, but we need to be the most advanced. So they set themselves a goal to be the best, but they're very aware of their backwardness. They are not saying that everything was invented, that we had aircraft in Vedic times. They're not saying any of this. They actually believe that they need to be among the best and be among the best today by today's standards. And if you look at it, over 3.6 million Chinese have been sent to study abroad. Many of them have come home from some of the world's best universities. And they've been like a sponge, just absorbing technology, ideas, science. I mean, it's just, and it's done on a national scale. And there is no shame about learning or admitting that they don't know. That, for me, is a huge difference when the entire society and state actually does this. It makes a big difference to the way a country progresses. And they didn't confuse themselves. Now they are confusing themselves by saying we have a glorious past, we should look back to the past, this, that, and the other. But, you know, that's not the way you manage such revolutionary change. They had other advantages, of course. That alliance with the US helped them. You know, it was a time when the global economy was open. As I said, the globalization years. All the other, there's a lot of tactical factors but they were smart enough to use it. That's my answer, but everyone will give you different answers for this.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is asked by Vivek. He asked, China had a no first use policy, so it makes no sense testing nuclear in context of China threat and then having a no first use policy. And it was India's nuclear test that gave legitimacy to Pakistan's nuclear testing. So was the nuclear testing in 1998 really required? Had it more to do with domestic politics than security concerns?
No, I don't think it had much to do with domestic politics. I think there are 3 reasons why I think that test was necessary. One is Pakistan already had nuclear weapons. So it wasn't a question of we legitimized Pakistani nuclear weapons. Pakistan had in fact, started her quest for nuclear weapons long before we even did 1974, Pokhran 1. In 1972, January, immediately after the birth of Bangladesh, Bhutto had called his generals and Ghulam Shah Khan together in Multan and had started this program. And by 1975, he went to Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong in April promised him Chinese help. And they actually gave them designs and, according to one account, tested a Pakistani weapon in 1990 in Xinjiang. So they knew, they had designs which they knew would work. By 1990, they were in a position to actually threaten us. And they did. 3 times they came and threatened us, saying, we will use our weapons against you. We will rain fire from the skies, to use Sahibzada Yaqub Khan's words. So they already had a weapon. We had the technology. We demonstrated it in 74. We hadn't built a weapon, but it would be irresponsible for any Indian leader to say, yeah, we live with Pakistan having a nuclear weapon and threatening us, but we won't. So the real purpose of Indian nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear blackmail and threats. And we had faced not just Pakistani threats. In 71, why did they send the Enterprise? An aircraft carrier which we knew carried nuclear weapons, a nuclear aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal. It was clear intimidation to try and stop us from doing what we were doing in Bangladesh. So we had faced threats and intimidation. Oddly enough, the Chinese have never threatened us with nuclear weapons. Either they haven't found it necessary, or they also thought that with no first use, it would not be credible. It wouldn't add to their credibility internationally. But like us, the Chinese initially followed the course of minimal deterrence. I mean, they kept, less than 200 warheads, but they just had enough to be able to neutralize the Americans, to threaten the Americans with a second strike if they ever use their nuclear weapons, and to threaten originally the Soviets as well. So, but that has changed. If you look since 1990, there has been a constant debate over and over again about the nature of China's weapons, whether she should develop tactical nuclear weapons. In other words, that's for first use and for battlefield use. And this is an internal Chinese debate. And all the signs in the last few years suggest that the Chinese are actually now increasing the numbers of their weapons by a huge amount. So it makes no sense for you, with adversarial relations with China, which have actually got worse over the last few years, not to have weapons. That's my second reason. Third reason is the technology is actually driving most of the nuclear weapon states to upgrade their arsenals, because remote sensing technology has improved to the point where they have to worry about survivability of their weapons. Today, thanks to not just satellites, but various other forms of remote sensing, you have a fairly good idea of what your adversary is doing, where he keeps his weapons, what he's doing. And the big fear is of a decapitation strike, that he can take out all your weapons and disarm you. That idea drives people to actually first use, to much more alert postures, where you mate your weapons with the missiles, etc., and is actually driving an arms race in the nuclear field. Now, in that situation, where your adversaries, both your potential adversaries, China and Pakistan, where the global arms race, nuclear weapons race is going on, where it's proliferating in terms of quality among existing, and where new countries are now making it quite clear that they would like to have weapons. They may not have the nerve to actually declare it yet, whether it's Iran. North Korea has the nerve, has declared it already. And frankly, when the lessons of the past, all those who gave up their nuclear weapons, Ukraine, Libya, Saddam Hussein, who claimed to have them when he didn't have them, you look at what happened to them, the motivation for everyone else to have nuclear weapons will be much higher. So in this situation, to actually give up weapons or to say we can do without weapons, to my mind, doesn't make sense. I think there's very good reason to actually have nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean you have to threaten other people or use it for nuclear blackmail. And therefore, for me, no first use makes sense. But then make sure that your weapons will survive so that there is real deterrence in the adversary's mind.
Thank you, sir. The chat box is filled with a lot of questions from our audiences. So with your permission, may we extend the session for a few more minutes?
Sure, sure.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question is from Kshitij. He asks, given the comprehensive national power of China and ability to influence other countries, can it be said that the world order is no longer unipolar?
Yes, my description of the world is actually that it's a world adrift. It's a world between orders. It's not bipolar, it's not unipolar, it's not multipolar either. I mean, it's fashionable to say it's multipolar. And my sort of summary is the world is multipolar economically because there are several major economies driving the world economy. The sources of world growth, I mean, China accounts for about 30% of growth in 2019 in a normal year. The US accounted for about 20, and various other countries, India accounted for about 15% in 2019, for instance, of global economic growth in terms of pushing the world economy. So it is multipolar economically, but militarily, it's still unipolar. There's only one power who can project military force anywhere on earth when she wants to, and that's the US. She is challenged regionally. There are regional military powers who can put up a fight. But even now, they can't necessarily match the US. China thinks she can probably, but China actually is a crowded, hemmed-in power, surrounded by established powers, by Russia, North Korea is not a small military power, South Korea, Japan, the US is right on her borders in the first island chain. So yes, but there is militarily, it's a unipolar world still. Politically, of course, you can see it's a thoroughly confused world. I mean, so therefore I say this is a world adrift. And I think COVID proved that you don't have a working international order at this moment. We'll find something. I mean, maybe it'll be multipolar, maybe bipolar. The Chinese hope it'll be bipolar between them and the Americans. But I don't think so. I don't think that's where we're going. But that's a matter of judgment. But today we don't have an order. So I wouldn't say it's either unipolar or bipolar or multipolar.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is asked by Vaibhav. He asked, India had to roll back on its farm reforms due to domestic pressure. US too had to pull out of Afghanistan due to growing internal pressure against fighting others' wars. China, on the other hand, has largely remained insulated from domestic politics while dealing in foreign political sphere. So rather than what Fukuyama perceived an end of ideology, can the China model give world a new ideological debate on organizing domestic politics?
I have a problem with the fundamental assumption there. I don't think China is exempt from the normal laws of politics. And in fact, I think the Chinese case, the internal drivers actually count for more in driving foreign policy than they do in other cases like India and the US. I've argued this in a paper which I think is on the ICS in the Institute of Chinese Studies website. It's also on the CSEP, the Center for Social Economic Progress website. It's called The Internal Drivers of Chinese Foreign Policy, China's External Politics. So and even internally, the Chinese leadership is not omniscient, omnipotent, they do have to. They tried, for instance, price reform to deflate the property bubble, and property asset prices have just gone through the roof, are still very high in China because there's very few places in China to put your money. You get nothing if you put it in the bank. Interest rates are very low. Stocks is a casino. So people actually invest in flats, in real estate. and just leave them empty, which is why 30% of the housing in China is empty. It's an asset class rather than, treated as housing. Government wanted to change this because the prices were going through the roof. They had to postpone it. And they announced the reform 3 years ago. Then they said, okay, we'll only try a pilot in a few cities. Now, last autumn, they said, okay, we'll look at it after a while. They do have to respond, because if this is where 70% of household savings are in real estate. So if you fiddle with real estate values, the whole Chinese middle class, which is huge, is busy losing their income. So they do have to respond to those kinds of, and the primary driver for the Chinese is keeping single party rule going. That is the most important from their point of view. And they run foreign policy accordingly, why do you think you see this peculiar situation of wolf warrior diplomacy, which makes enemies all around China? I mean, their behavior is hardly friendly, because it plays well at home. So in other words, it matters what happens at home. And most important, because the great leader feels good that we've all stood up and showed our chest to the world, and we've told them what to do, where they get off. But it's not effective diplomacy. In fact, if you look at popularity levels for China, trust in Xi Jinping, Southeast Asians do an annual survey. Pew does a survey of all the advanced countries. All of them show, the Lowy Institute, Australia does surveys. Every one of them shows declining trust in China. Dislike and favorability ratios have steadily declined over the last decade. I mean, India is, of course, special. We are one of the lowest in terms of trust in China. So I wouldn't say that their foreign policy is completely divorced from their internal situation. In fact, I think it's actually driven more by that and less by this traditional foreign policy calculus. What's the situation, what's the country's interests, and how does it, whereas here, I think the role of personalities, of the leader, of the CCP's desire to stay in power, these things actually matter much more.
Thank you, sir. Next question we have is, have we been isolated in Afghanistan? Was it a diplomatic failure on our part?
I don't think so. We knew since 2011 that the US was going to withdraw. The only question was the terms and when. I have always said that, they need to, if they're going, let them go quickly. This hanging around and in the process destroying the credibility of the Afghan government and giving, Pakistan a bigger role, etc., trying to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal with the Taliban doesn't make sense, frankly. But anyway, look at the consequences. What has happened since the US withdrew? Militant attacks in Pakistan have gone up through the roof. TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, all these militant groups in Pakistan now have got renewed josh from what they think is a great victory in Afghanistan. Not even Pakistan has recognized this Taliban regime, unlike the last time around in 1996. Same problem for the Chinese, the Russians. They were all saying, yes, the US should withdraw, go away. But they have to deal with the consequences, the neighbors, Iran. And the consequence of an unstable Afghanistan, where the Haqqani network and the Taliban are in power, is frankly that they will export militancy, instability, terrorism. They will support separatist groups in Xinjiang. I mean, it's in their DNA, and they can't not do so. And if they don't do so, the Islamic State is waiting to be even more radical and even worse than them. So I don't know why we feel somehow that we are isolated. The first impact will be on those who are physically in contact with them. And that's where the problem is. And frankly, I think it will lead them to slightly more rational policies. As long as for them, it was a question of play acting and they were not responsible, the Americans were doing the fighting for them, it was all right. You could treat it as political theater and use it. Now they have to deal with the real consequences. One reason why I think the Pakistanis renewed the old ceasefire is because now they really have to worry about what's happening to their West and what's happening in Pakistan as a result. So I think we need to look at this much more dispassionately than are we isolated. Yes, we are isolated in terms of, do the Taliban like you? Does Haqqani network like you? Okay, maybe not. IS doesn't like you. But those are not friends you want to have. So give it time. Let them understand their interests. And we're here. We're not going anywhere. And we'll be back in Afghanistan too. But that doesn't mean that every day you have to be, active in Afghanistan. Let them learn their lessons, and then we'll see.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is asked by Dipali. Within the shifting global landscape, do India really has the opportunity to put in place a new framework for its own security, growth, and development, and that of developing countries around the world? If yes, then what could be the strategy or basic important considerations while doing so?
Well, I think we have an opportunity if we take measures to strengthen ourselves. Because in a world, as I said, adrift, a world between orders, you can't rely on the international system to do things like maritime security and other global public goods are not provided by the international system. You saw during COVID, the international system doesn't provide it. So you have to do much more yourself. So it becomes your responsibility to do these things. If you can do that, you have an opportunity to create a new strategic framework for yourself. One important result of this uncertain world that I described is that there is an opportunity to work with a host of other countries, both developing countries and middle powers, whether it's Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, and what you can see what's happening with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, where relations have improved tremendously in the last few years. You have an opportunity today to work with them all because they're all adrift. They're all in the same position as you, looking at a world which is much more uncertain, much more fragmented, where the traditional great powers are no longer there. They're not providing what you need for your security. So yes, there is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity only for those who are capable of taking it. And you have to make yourself capable of taking it, both mentally and physically.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Saurabh. Russia, China, Pakistan nexus is now building up, and Chinese aggression on border is also intensifying. So what's the way forward for India?
You see, you have to deal with your problems on your border yourself. That is clear. It always has been. Nobody else is going to come. I mean, even for Ukraine, all the talk from the West, they're not willing to send troops for Ukraine. Nobody is willing to fight for Ukraine. They'll egg them on, they'll pass resolutions, do sanctions, and so on. But you have to deal with you have to maintain the effective balance on the border, which maintains peace, which deters aggression. And that's important. And when it breaks down, like it did in 2020, you have to restore that balance. That's true vis-a-vis the Chinese, it's true vis-a-vis the Pakistanis. I don't think you should frighten yourself with this Axis business. Because what's an Axis going to do? Again, if they're not willing to fight for you, they're not willing to fight for each other either. They're an axis of convenience. Where they have a common interest, then they don't have a common interest in dealing with you. China and Pakistan might have some common interest, but I don't think Russia has an interest in promoting Chinese designs on your border or in promoting Pakistan against you. You have a relationship with Russia, which you need to work. You need to adjust to today's situation. So I would say, first thing is self-strengthening. I mean, I keep coming back to this, I'm afraid. And certainly for dealing with your land borders and your land neighbors, that is critical. Without self-strengthening, there's no other way. Then the larger thing is you step up your game, your economic game, you try and integrate the subcontinent economically with India. Secondly, you become a provider of security in the Indian Ocean region, in the subcontinent. You become a source of stability in their eyes. They look to you for the stability rather than a source of instability. And then I think you can cope with the increased interest of other powers in your neighborhood. And it should be possible for you to do so. And, I have a mantra that I use for these. Issue-based coalitions, the willing. Depending on the issue, you will find different partners you can work with. It means very hard diplomacy and hard work, but you will not find the same partners across the board on all issues. When it's maritime security, you will work with the US, with Australia, Japan, and the Quad, with Southeast Asian countries, because they are interested in the free flow of and the safety of your maritime. When it's cybersecurity, you'll have a different set of partners. When it comes to the land borders, frankly, you're on your own. Nobody else is going to take care of those problems. So for different issues, energy security, you'll have a strange set of partners. Actually, the biggest importers, you're the third biggest importer of oil in the world, after the Chinese and the Japanese. Number 4 is South Korea. This is a different set of partners that you would find if you're looking for security there. So on each issue, and therefore my mantra in today's world, in this confused world, is issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. And you pick the issues that really matter to you. Which ones stop India's transformation? Which ones will push India's transformation? Those are the ones that matter to you, not the issues that will not. And there, I think it's a very simple criteria that you have to apply. And I think that's the way forward in this kind of confusion, fog, myth, maze,
Thank you, sir. We're taking the last question for the session, a question which we cannot afford to miss. Sir, Rashmita asked, I wanted to ask what led you to join the Indian Foreign Services?
Honestly, it was an accident. Let me explain. I studied ancient Indian history, ancient Chinese history, Sanskrit, and classical Chinese. And I wanted to do a PhD on kingship, because India and China were unified within 100 years of each other, Mauryas, Qin China. And they both had manuals written, Kautilya and Han Feizi. And you would expect them to be similar, right? But you read them, they're completely different ideas of how to run a kingdom, of what to do. And so I wanted to, and I was interested in ancient world, frankly, but I wanted to see China. And this is the late 60s, early 70s. And the only way for an Indian to go was either become an Naxalite, go underground, or else become a diplomat and go. And so I thought, do the easy way, do the exam. If I get in good, I'll go, I'll see China 3 years, and then I'll come back and go back to my PhD. But I got hooked. I mean, I really loved the job. So 42 years in government, that's quite a bit. But I loved every minute of it. I was lucky. So I suppose the real answer is, why did I join the Foreign Service? Luck. It's sheer luck.
Thank you, sir. With this, we end our question answer session. मैं सर का धन्यवाद करना चाहूंगा जिन्होंने सभी प्रश्नों का इतने धैर्य से उत्तर दिया. Also, now I would like to invite Ms. Rashmi Satyal, President of Kartavya, to propose the official word of thanks.
Thank you, Lakshay. Am I audible clearly?
You are.
Okay, thank you. So it is my honor to propose a formal vote of thanks. First, I would like to thank Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, sir, who joined us today by taking out time from his busiest schedule. And obviously, your views are words of wisdom for us, and we would definitely follow them in our endeavor to contribute more in the area. I extend my heartfelt thanks to our principal, Madam Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan. She was not able to join us today due to her commitments. I must not forgetful in thanking our teacher convener, Dr. Vikram Singh Chaudhary, and the other teachers from the advisory committee who constantly support us and extend every possible cooperation for the event. Also, my heartfelt gratitude to the all team members of Kartavya family and everyone who worked behind the scene for this event. And last but not the least, the beautiful and the very decent audience who cooperated and joined us in such a huge number so early morning. Thank you everyone. And once again, thanks to Sir for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Thanks. All the
Thank
best.
you. Desire is the key to motivation, but it's determination and commitment to an unrelenting pursuit of your goal, a commitment to excellence that will enable you to attain the success you seek. With this, we end our today's session here. I would like to thank all of you who graced us today with their presence. You can all leave the meeting now.
Also, you can stop